We often hear expressions about those having the least given the most. You know, someone struggling from paycheck to paycheck is more likely to share his meagre earnings with a homeless person than a successful businessman would be. But exactly how true is this sentiment? Why do we view people with more money as being less likely to share it? A kidnapping is an interesting context to view this question in, because kidnappings are more likely to be targeted at rich people. Obviously, you want to extort as much money as possible out of the procedure, so kidnappers rely on the rich person's desperation to have their loved ones released to pressure them into paying a massive ransom. It isn't as preferable to kidnap someone from a poor background because they're unlikely to be able to muster up as large an amount of cash, but do our perceptions of wealth and goodwill hold true in these situations? Is the average person more willing to part with their wealth to set their loved ones free? Or, when push comes to shove and lives are on the line, are the rich prepared to go just as far for their family? Paul Getty was born in 1892 in Minnesota, USA. His father, an attorney, was a wealthy man, and he established an oil business in Paul's youth. As he got older, Paul helped his father expand the business, and soon enough, he was a millionaire. It's a story we've all heard a million times. He's rich because his daddy's rich. But don't underestimate Paul. Paul was probably an even more astute businessman than his father, and his wealth continued to grow after his father's death. He made shrewd investments and brokered impressive deals, reportedly learning Arabic so he could directly negotiate with the King of Saudi Arabia, securing a 60-year contract for their oil. By the 50s, he was the richest living American, and by the 60s, he was the world's richest private citizen, being a billionaire. I'll be honest, even if I had the same promising start in life, I severely doubt I would have accomplished that. In fact, I'd be willing to say that starting off life with that kind of money probably would have done me more harm than good. I'm a slow learner. I have to suffer before I can prosper. Put me in Paul's shoes and I'd end up like the child of a famous actor or something. Just an absolute train wreck of a human being. I mean, even more so than now. So I have to respect Paul's business intuition. He had a good start, but he was no slouch. But don't confuse that for admiration, because this guy was a piece of work. He's everything you would imagine this sort of fella to be. Soulless, completely amoral, evil even. He's like the rich villain from a cartoon. In fact, with what I'm about to tell you, you'd be forgiven for thinking I was talking about a cartoon character. But this story is as real as it gets. Paul Getty was pretty miserly with his money, famously having a payphone installed in his house, so his staff and guests had to pay for their own calls. His sharp business mind did little to ingratiate him with those around him. For every bit of success Paul had in the business world, he had an abundance of failed personal relationships. He had 5 marriages and 5 divorces. He was quoted as saying, "A lasting relationship with a woman is only possible if you are a business failure," which still doesn't explain where I'm going wrong, but it's a pretty hilariously evil thing to say. He had 5 sons with these many wives, and if you think he'd be more affectionate with his own flesh and blood, well, he didn't attend the wedding of his firstborn son, who later committed suicide. After his death, Paul was reportedly more concerned over which remaining son would inherit his business empire. One son was immediately discounted from this because he had taken his mother's side during the divorce, leading Paul to cut him out of his will. His 5th wife recounted how Paul scolded her for spending too much money. What was she spending that money on? Medical treatment for their 6-year-old son, who had a brain tumour. He died at age 12. Paul did not attend the funeral. One son, Paul Getty Jr., aka Paul II, spent much of his life in Italy, where he looked after the Italian division of the family oil business. He had 4 sons, including Paul III, who was born in 1956, before divorcing that wife and remarrying another. These two adopted a sort of hippie lifestyle and fell heavily into drug use. By the time Paul III was 14 in 1971, his stepmother died of a heroin overdose, and his father moved back to the UK, fearing his own drug use and possession would land him in legal trouble in the aftermath of his wife's death. John Paul III stayed in Italy, however, and he lived the sort of life I think I'd be more likely to lead being born rich. Practically parentless, he was a rebellious teen, getting kicked out of school for vandalism. He adopted his father and stepmother's bohemian lifestyle, leading an aimless life of hedonism and partying. That was until he got kidnapped. On July 10th, 1973, John Paul III was kidnapped from Rome at the age of 16, blindfolded and transported to a remote location in southern Italy. His kidnappers were members of the 'Ndrangheta, an Italian mafia syndicate. 'Ndrangheta. I may be pronouncing that wrong, but fucking look at this. It's like some shite out of a fantasy novel. A ransom note was sent, demanding $17 million for John Paul III's safe return. His father, Jean Paul II, did not have the money to pay the ransom, and so he went to his father, Jean Paul I, for help. Well, that old miserly bastard refused to give any money. He had 14 grandchildren and claimed if he paid Jean Paul III's ransom, he'd have 13 new ransoms to pay shortly after. Actually, some were skeptical about the kidnapping, and they actually believed it may have been some sort of joke by the teen, or a scheme to extort money from his billionaire grandfather. How could they believe such a thing? Well, there may have been some truth to it, believe it or not. Jean Paul III lived the life of a rich kid, but he wasn't a businessman and he didn't secure his own wealth. Soon, he was struggling to make ends meet. Some believed he may have played a part in the kidnapping to get some money for himself. His girlfriend at the time supposedly told the police that he had entertained the idea of orchestrating his own kidnapping. He allegedly decided not to go through with the plan, but the criminals he had been planning with had other ideas and took him anyway. The same woman later claimed that she had never said that and the police had made it up. The kidnapping situation went on for months, although this was partly due to an Italian postal strike that went on for 3 weeks and delayed the delivery of further demands. During this time, the kidnappers were growing increasingly frustrated and Jean Paul III's treatment grew worse. Jean Paul still wasn't giving up his money, but the kidnappers were done playing games. In November, an envelope arrived containing a lock of hair, a human ear, and a threat. If $3 million was not delivered within the next 10 days, they could expect another envelope with another body part. In reality, things were not going so smooth for the kidnappers. They really had cut off John Paul III's ear, but the wound became infected. Jean Paul's health rapidly declined, and the kidnappers took to supplying him with drugs and alcohol to ease his suffering. Things weren't looking good for the 16-year-old. The kidnappers knew they had to get him off their hands soon. Now convinced that this was no joke, John Paul II again went to his father for help, and would you believe, he still wasn't ready to pay the full ransom. He did put up $2.2 million though. Why $2.2 million instead of the full amount? Because he had sat down with his accountant and figured out $2.2 million was the maximum amount that could be tax deductible. Unbelievable. Serious levels of villainy here, but that's not all. He agreed to lend Jean Paul II the remaining $800,000 for the ransom, on the condition that Junior would pay it back with 4% interest. Let me reiterate, this man was one of the richest men on the planet and would only pay the ransom for his grandson when he could put it down as a tax write-off and charge his son interest for the rest. You know, I said earlier I had no admiration for this guy, but honestly, this is amorality on a level I didn't think existed in real life. This is so evil, it's actually entertaining. I started the video disgusted by him, but now I'm almost sort of liking him, just out of respect for his absolute savagery. His evil is so pure, I've been corrupted by just observing it. John Paul III was freed at a remote location in the Italian countryside in December. He was in rough shape, but would survive. He called his grandfather to thank him for paying the ransom, but old Jean Paul refused to come to the phone, probably too busy kicking puppies. 9 members of the Ndrangheta were apprehended in relation to the kidnapping, but only 2 were convicted due to lack of evidence. Most of the ransom money was never recovered. As for John Paul III, well, if this story is already a bit dark for your liking, I'd recommend switching over to my more light-hearted videos now, because it doesn't get any better from here. Deeply affected by the ordeal, John Paul Getty III suffered from drug and alcohol addiction for years following the kidnapping, stemming from both the trauma of the incident and the large amount of substances he was medicated with by his captors. In 1981, he ingested a cocktail of Valium, methadone and alcohol that triggered a stroke and liver failure. John Paul was left quadriplegic, partially blind and unable to speak. His mother became his primary caretaker and she sued his father for medical expenses. He remained severely disabled for the rest of his life until his death in 2011 at the age of 54. Not really much I can say about that. I will ask one favour though. Call up your loved ones and tell them how much they mean to you. You may not have the perfect relationship, the perfect life together, but who does? I'm not the smartest man in the world and will never be the richest. And the chances are you and I are in the same boat in that regard. But when you make that phone call, keep in mind, you have something that the richest man in the world didn't.